What if I told you that the end of the greatest civilization in history began not with a loud declaration of war, but with a simple request for help? The Roman Empire seemed like an eternal monolith, an indestructible rock against which any waves of barbarian invasions broke. Legions marched along paved roads, borders were guarded by impregnable forts, and in Constantinople, emperors decided the fate of the world, confident in their divine invulnerability. But on one hot August day, this illusion of security and grandeur crumbled to dust in a matter of hours. History knows moments when the world changes instantly, when old rules cease to apply, and the future becomes frighteningly uncertain. The Battle of Adrianople was just such a moment, a point of no return, after which the ancient world began its rapid decline. This is not just a story about the battle between two armies. It is a drama about pride, corruption, and a fateful combination of circumstances. We will see how the greed of a few officials can destroy the work of many generations, and how underestimating the enemy leads to a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one wrong decision turned the Roman army to dust, and why, after that day, Rome was never able to return to its former glory. What if I told you that everything you believed was not true? We are used to thinking of barbarians as mindless conquerors, thirsty only for destruction and gold. But the reality of 376 was quite different. It was not an invading army that approached the banks of the Danube, the natural border of the Roman Empire, but an endless stream of refugees seeking salvation from an unknown horror that was destroying entire nations. People fled in panic, dragging along children, the elderly, and whatever possessions they could carry. Tens of thousands of Goths, entire families with their belongings, stood on the northern bank, looking hopefully at the Roman watchtowers on the other side, and believing that Rome, so powerful and rich, would give them refuge. They were driven by fear of a new, formidable force that had come from the east, the Huns, who swept away everything in their path like a natural disaster, leaving no chance for resistance. The Goths did not want war with Rome. They begged for protection and the right to settle on imperial lands as peaceful farmers and allies. Their leaders sent envoys to Emperor Valens with an offer that seemed impossible to refuse. They promised to supply soldiers for the Roman army in exchange for land and security, providing the empire with new recruits and allies at the same time. For an empire in constant need of soldiers and buffer zones, this seemed like a gift from fate, capable of strengthening its borders at minimal cost and risk. Valens, busy with the war against the Persians in the east, saw this as a brilliant opportunity to solve his staffing problems with a stroke of the pen, without delving deeply into the consequences and scale of the process he was initiating. Permission to cross was granted, and a huge mass of people set off, filling boats, rafts, and even tree trunks to cross the turbulent Danube. Women held children in their arms, men pushed overloaded boats, and old people prayed to the gods for salvation. Roman border guards, accustomed to minor skirmishes, watched with alarm as this endless stream continued day and night, turning the border into a zone of chaos. No one kept an accurate count, but modern historians estimate the number to be over 100,000 people, which was a colossal figure for the ancient world, comparable to the migration of an entire nation. The logistics of such an operation were a nightmare for which the imperial administration was completely unprepared, and the first hours of the crossing showed that the situation was spiraling out of control. Instead of an organized reception of refugees on the shore, chaos reigned, exacerbated by the language barrier and mutual distrust. The Romans, accustomed to looking down on barbarians, did not see them as people in need of help, but only as a resource or a potential threat that needed to be kept at a distance. The emperor's orders to provide food for the migrants were only carried out on paper, ending up in the pockets of local officials known for their greed. The Goths, who had surrendered their weapons, though not all of them, as a sign of peaceful intentions, found themselves trapped on a narrow strip of land between the river and the Roman cordons, deprived of freedom of movement and the ability to obtain food. The food supplies they had brought with them were rapidly dwindling, and the promised imperial aid never arrived in the required quantities. Hunger became a constant companion in the camp, causing discontent and despair among those who, only yesterday, had hoped for a new life. The first deaths from exhaustion occurred. Children cried through the night, women shared the last handfuls of grain, and men lost their patience. The leaders, Fritigern and Alaviv, tried to maintain order, but it became more difficult with each passing day to restrain the huge mass of hungry people. Instead of diffusing the situation, the Roman commanders on the ground only exacerbated the tension with their arrogance, forbidding the migrants from leaving the camp while failing to provide them with provisions. The situation on the banks of the Danube resembled a powder keg to which a burning fuse was slowly but surely being brought. It was the first act of a tragedy in which bureaucratic incompetence collided with human despair, creating the perfect conditions for an explosion that was now impossible to prevent. None of the participants in the events yet understood that this migration of peoples would be the beginning of the end of the familiar world order. For the world that had been built over centuries proved too fragile in the face of such massive upheavals. The empire let in a force that it couldn't control or assimilate, and the consequences of this move will be felt for decades to come. History teaches us that the best intentions often turn into disaster if they are carried out by selfish people. Here we see a classic example of how a refugee crisis turns into a military conflict due to a lack of competent management and basic care for people. The Romans saw the Goths as nothing more than cheap labor in a temporary army, not realizing that they were dealing with a proud and warlike people who would not tolerate humiliation. This misperception, this blindness on the part of the authorities, would prove fatal for thousands of Roman citizens in the near future when events spiraled out of control and escalated into open warfare. It is interesting to see how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world. Where are you from? Do you agree with the arguments presented? Are you ready to learn the truth about how corruption can destroy a state faster than any enemy army? The Roman troops in Thrace were commanded by two men whose names have become synonymous with shame and greed: Lupicinus and Maximus. These officials saw the plight of the Goths not as a humanitarian disaster, but as an exceptional opportunity for personal enrichment. Instead of distributing the grain allocated by the emperor, they created an artificial shortage, driving prices sky high. The market that spontaneously arose near the walls of the Roman camp turned into a scene of monstrous, cynical trade, where human life itself became a commodity. The Goths, exhausted by hunger, were ready to give everything they had for a piece of bread or a handful of rotten grain. At first, they offered gold jewelry, precious fabrics, and the remains of their possessions that they had managed to save during their flight. But when their material possessions ran out, the Roman governors offered a new, terrible currency. In exchange for food of the lowest quality, often unfit for consumption, the Goths were forced to sell themselves into slavery. Free warriors, proud people who had never known chains, gave up their freedom in order to survive another day. Roman merchants and officers, taking advantage of the desperate situation, bought people wholesale as if they were cattle, counting their fabulous profits. This trade was conducted openly with the tacit consent of Lupicinus, who received his share from each transaction. The situation reached the point of absurdity when a loaf of bread or a piece of questionable meat was exchanged for a human being into slavery. The Goths endured this humiliation, gritting their teeth, but in their hearts boiled a cold, fierce hatred for those whom they had recently considered their saviors. Every exchange, every transaction brought the inevitable explosion closer, but the Roman officials were blinded by the glitter of gold. They forgot the old truth: you cannot endlessly humiliate those who know how to wield weapons. Lupicinus, wanting to finally quell the brewing rebellion, decided to use an old Roman tactic: eliminate the leaders under the guise of negotiations. He invited the Gothic leaders, Fritigern and Alaviv, to a lavish banquet in the city of Marcianopolis, promising to discuss supply issues. While the leaders were in the palace, a quarrel broke out between the Roman guards and the hungry Goths who had remained outside the city walls. The Roman soldiers, accustomed to mocking the refugees with impunity, this time met with fierce resistance, which escalated into an open confrontation. The noise of the battle reached the banquet hall, and Lupicinus, panicking, ordered the guards of the Gothic leaders to be killed and the leaders themselves to be captured. This was a betrayal that violated all the laws of hospitality, sacred to both Romans and barbarians. But Fritigern, displaying wonders of diplomacy and cunning, managed to convince Lupicinus that only he could calm the crowd. The Roman governor, frightened by the scale of the beginning uprising, allowed Fritigern to go out to his people, hoping for his authority. This was his fatal mistake. Once free, Fritigern did not calm the people, but led them. He mounted his horse and declared that peace with Rome was broken and that the time for patience and humiliation was over. At that moment, the Goths ceased to be refugees and became warriors again, now with only one goal: revenge for all their suffering. Disparate groups united into a single force, driven not simply by the desire to plunder, but by the desire to survive at any cost. The illusion of control that Roman officials had been entertaining collapsed overnight. The greed of two men, Lupicinus and Maximus, turned potential allies of the empire into its deadliest enemies. They didn't just steal money or grain, they stole the empire's security, selling it for a pittance. The story of Marcianopolis became the starting point of a war that would forever change the map of Europe. Do you think the Romans could have prevented the conflict if they had shown honesty and respect for agreements? I discovered this by accident while studying old maps of troop movements. The Gothic uprising was not a chaotic rebellion of savages, as it was often described in Roman chronicles. The more I looked at the routes, the clearer it became that each change of position was part of a well-thought-out plan. Under Fritigern's command, the Goths demonstrated remarkable organization and tactical flexibility, which the imperial legions were not prepared for. Fritigern understood that his men had little chance in open battle against the heavy Roman infantry, so he chose a different strategy based on maneuver and cunning. He observed the enemy's weaknesses and used them to his advantage, avoiding situations where the legionaries were at their strongest. The Goths used their mobility, turning the territory of Thrace itself into their ally, avoiding major clashes and striking where they were not expected. They knew the landscape better than the Romans, using every valley, ravine, and forest path to remain invisible until the moment of attack. The backbone of their army was not infantry, but swift cavalry, capable of quickly moving long distances and attacking the flanks, disrupting the Roman formation. But the most unique invention that became the hallmark of the Gothic army was the Wagenburg, a mobile fortress that provided them with mobile protection. This was not a random decision. The Goths had spent years perfecting this method, turning ordinary carts into a tool for survival and victory. When stopping or under threat of attack, the Goths would arrange their numerous carts into a tight circle or square, linking them together with wooden latches and chains. This structure created a powerful defensive line that was extremely difficult for enemy cavalry or infantry to overcome, and it was protected up close by spearmen and heavy shields. Inside this circle were supplies, wounded soldiers, and the families of warriors, which gave the fighters additional motivation. They were defending their homes, not an abstract position on a map. The Wagenburg turned any temporary settlement of the Goths into a fortress that Roman troops could not quickly break through, which completely changed the dynamics of the battle. The Romans, accustomed to fighting an enemy lined up in linear battle formations, were at a loss against this fortress on wheels. Their traditional tactics, based on a disciplined attack in close formation, failed because the Wagenburg blocked a direct strike and forced them to look for detours. The Wagenfort allowed the Goths to control the battlefield, imposing their conditions and pace of battle on the enemy and limiting the Romans' maneuvers. From the cover of the wagons, Gothic archers could rain down a hail of arrows and javelins on the legionaries with impunity, forcing them to break formation and become easy prey for cavalry attacks. Fritigern also made active use of reconnaissance, knowing much more about the movements of the Roman troops than the Romans knew about him. He sent out small cavalry detachments in all directions, creating a false impression of the size and location of his forces. These groups would attack and then disappear, preventing the Romans from tracking the main Gothic forces. Roman generals often chased ghosts, mistaking scouts for large detachments, while the main forces of the Goths struck unprotected communications, destroying bridges, warehouses, and roads. They disrupted supplies, forcing the Romans to act blindly and lose the initiative. Other discontented people began to join the uprising. Runaway slaves, deserters from the Roman army, and even workers from the gold mines, exhausted by hard labor. Fritigern's army grew not only in numbers, but also in quality, gaining people who knew Roman tactics and the terrain from the inside. These deserters brought with them information about the location of fortresses, supply routes, and weak points in Roman discipline. This was no longer just a tribal revolt, but a real social revolution directed against the imperial order, which no longer suited the broad masses of the population. The Goths did not seek to capture cities, realizing that they lacked the siege equipment and skills to storm stone walls, and that long sieges would only increase their own losses. Instead, they ravaged the countryside, depriving Roman garrisons of food supplies and fodder. They destroyed fields, drove away livestock, and burned farms, forcing the Romans to leave their safe fortresses and fight on the Goths' terms. It was a strategy of attrition designed to exert prolonged pressure that would break the region's economy and the will of its commanders. Fritigern proved himself not as a barbarian chieftain, but as a calculating commander capable of outmaneuvering graduates of Roman military academies. He used the weaknesses of the Roman military machine, its sluggishness and dependence on logistics, against it, creating situations where the discipline and order of the legions became a burden. Every day of delay worked in the Goths' favor, allowing them to strengthen their positions and build up their forces. The Romans, on the other hand, lost confidence in victory and the ability to impose their terms with each passing day. Thus, what began as a spontaneous revolt turned into a well-organized military campaign. The unique tactics, combining the mobility of the cavalry and the reliability of the wagon fort, became the surprise that broke the backbone of Roman strategy and showed that a new era in military affairs had already begun. Fritigern did not just win a series of battles, he broke the usual order of things in the Balkans. Like this, if you are interested in ancient battle tactics and unconventional military solutions. What if I showed you a time machine? Let's travel to the headquarters of Emperor Valens, where a decision was made that determined the fate of the empire. Valens, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, was an ambitious man, but he was forever overshadowed by his more successful nephew and co-ruler, Gratian, Emperor of the West. Gratian was victorious over the barbarians on the Rhine, and his fame resounded throughout the Roman world, causing Valens to feel intense envy and inferiority. When news of the Gothic uprising reached Valens, he hastened to make peace with the Persians and moved his legions westward to Adrianople. Gratian sent a message asking his uncle to wait for him to arrive so that they could join forces and crush the barbarians. It was a reasonable, strategically sound proposal that would have given the Romans overwhelming numerical superiority. However, Valens' advisors, playing on his wounded pride, whispered to him that a victory shared with Gratian would not bring him the glory he desired. They convinced the emperor that the Goths were weak, disorganized, and could easily be defeated by his own forces. The desire for sole triumph overshadowed the voice of reason. Valens did not want to share the laurels of victory with his young nephew. The situation was exacerbated by a fatal mistake by intelligence, which reported that the Goth army numbered only about 10,000 men. In reality, this figure reflected only part of the forces visible to the scouts, while the main forces of the Gothic cavalry were foraging in the distance. Believing in his luck and numerical superiority, Valens decided not to wait for reinforcements from the west. The emperor gave the order to immediately advance on the Gothic camp located near the city of Adrianople. This decision was made in haste, without proper preparation and study of the terrain. Valens was confident that he was not going into a difficult battle, but rather an easy punitive operation against a handful of rebels. He ignored the warnings of his more experienced commanders, who sensed something was wrong and urged caution. The Roman camp was filled with a spirit of recklessness, fueled by rumors of the enemy's weakness and imminent victory. No one wanted to think that intelligence could be wrong and that the enemy could have set a trap. The emperor's pride became the factor that turned a tactical task into a gamble with the life of the empire at stake. Valens was not afraid of defeat. He was afraid that Gratian would arrive too early and steal his victory. This fear led him to make the worst mistake a commander can make, underestimating the enemy. The march to the battlefield began under the scorching sun, along a rocky road, without sufficient water supplies. The soldiers marched toward their fate, led by the ambitions of one man who placed his personal glory above the interests of the state. History is unforgiving to those who allow emotions to control armies. The decision to attack without Western support was a point of no return. Valens personally signed his own death warrant and that of thousands of his soldiers. How often do you think the personal ambitions of leaders cause military disasters? The morning of August 9, 378 was not just hot, it was scorching. The sun of Thrace burned mercilessly, turning the steppe into a scorching frying pan where even the air shimmered with heat. The Roman army left Adrianople at dawn, leaving behind food supplies, baggage trains, and heavy equipment in order to move faster. Emperor Valens drove his soldiers forward, forcing them to cover kilometer after kilometer of rough terrain. The journey to the camp was about 18 kilometers, and the march itself was an ordeal. The legionnaires, clad in heavy armor, with shields and weapons, were drenched in sweat, choking on the dust kicked up by thousands of sandals. The water in their flasks ran out quickly, and there was nowhere to replenish their supplies. The springs had dried up or were inaccessible. Hunger also made itself felt, as the soldiers had not eaten since morning, expecting a quick battle and lunch in the captured camp. By the time the Roman vanguard saw the Goths' carts, the army was already physically and morally exhausted. The Goths had positioned their wagon fort on a hill, which gave them the tactical advantage of height. The Romans had to attack uphill, overcoming not only the resistance of the enemy, but also gravity itself. Fritigern had chosen the perfect position. It allowed him to survey the approaches and control the situation. The Roman army began to deploy into battle formation on the march, amid chaos and confusion. The right wing of the cavalry broke ahead, the infantry lagged behind, and the left flank was still catching up. The orderly lines that Rome was so proud of were broken by the uneven terrain and the fatigue of the soldiers. The sun was at its zenith, and its rays beat directly into the eyes of the advancing Romans, blinding them and preventing them from aiming. The iron of their armor was so hot that it burned their skin, turning their protection into an instrument of torture. Men fainted from heat stroke even before the first signal to attack sounded. The roar of voices, the clang of weapons, and the pounding of thousands of feet merged into a monotonous, oppressive noise. The tension hung in the air, thick as a storm cloud. The soldiers knew that the command was rushing them, that they were not ready for battle, but discipline drove them forward. Valens, watching the formation, still believed that the mere sight of his legions would be enough to make the barbarians beg for mercy. He did not see the exhausted faces of his soldiers. He saw only the standards and the glitter of the eagles. The reality of war was hidden from him by a veil of his own grandeur. At that moment, calm reigned in the Goth camp. They saw the condition of the Romans and understood that time was on their side. Fritigern waited for his cavalry to return, stalling for time and preparing to slam the trap shut. This march was a prelude to disaster. An exhausted, dehydrated army, thrown into battle against a fresh enemy occupying an advantageous position, was doomed to heavy losses. Nature was on the side of the barbarians that day. Guess what happened next? When the two armies faced each other, the battlefield was suddenly engulfed in acrid, suffocating smoke. The Goths had set fire to the dry grass and bushes in front of their positions. The wind blew toward the Romans, and thick clouds of smoke enveloped the legions, intensifying their thirst, heat, and disorientation. It was a simple but ingenious tactical ploy that further exhausted the already weary soldiers of the empire. In this smoky hell under the scorching sun, strange, protracted negotiations began. Fritigern again sent envoys to Valens, offering peace and hostages in exchange for safety. Historians still argue whether he really wanted to avoid battle or was simply stalling for time, waiting for the return of his heavy cavalry, which was out foraging. Valens hesitated. The sight of the huge barbarian camp and the fatigue of his own troops made him doubt an easy victory. He entered into dialogue, demanding noble hostages to save face. The negotiations proceeded slowly, with envoys traveling back and forth, while the soldiers stood under the scorching sun, fully armed, unable to rest or drink water. Everyone's nerves were on edge. The Roman soldiers on the right flank, unable to withstand the tension and provocations from the Gothic archers, broke into an attack without orders. Two detachments of elite archers, scutari, rushed forward toward the wagon fort, pulling the rest with them. It was a disorganized, spontaneous attack that disrupted the fragile balance of the negotiations. The Goths responded with a hail of arrows, and the Roman vanguard, without support from the main forces, was thrown back in disgrace. A battle began that no one could control, a chaos that could not be stopped. At that very moment, as if on schedule, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, rapidly approaching the battlefield. It was the Gothic cavalry returning under the leadership of Valens and Saphrac, the very 10,000 that Roman intelligence had failed to notice. They flew like lightning striking from the mountains, straight at the unprotected left flank of the Romans. The negotiations were just a smokescreen, a backdrop behind which the main strike was being prepared. Fritigern outplayed Valens completely, forcing his army to stand in the heat until reinforcements arrived. The moment for the strike was chosen perfectly. The Romans were disorganized by the unsuccessful attack and relaxed by the expectation of peace. With the arrival of the cavalry, hopes for a peaceful outcome evaporated along with the smoke from the fires. The trap had snapped shut. The Roman army found itself trapped between the impregnable wagon fort and an avalanche of enemy cavalry. In the next chapter, you will learn how this cavalry attack changed the course of history. What would you have done in the commander's place? Waited for the negotiations to end, or attacked immediately? The appearance of the Gothic cavalry came as a complete surprise to the Romans, a shock from which they were unable to recover. The heavy cavalry of the barbarians, which included not only Goths but also Alans, famous for their horsemanship, descended on the Roman formation with devastating force. They struck the right flank of the Roman cavalry, which, unable to withstand the pressure, was crushed and put to flight. The Roman horsemen, who were supposed to cover the infantry, simply disappeared from the battlefield, leaving the legions defenseless on the flanks. It was a classic hammer and anvil maneuver, with the infantry formation at Wagenburg playing the role of the anvil and the arriving cavalry playing the role of the hammer. The blow was so powerful that the left flank of the Roman army was instantly pushed back to the center. The space for maneuver was rapidly narrowing. Thousands of people found themselves squeezed into a small patch of land, unable to turn around or retreat. The Gothic cavalry, having broken through the defenses, began to surround the Roman infantry, driving them into a deadly cauldron. The noise of battle turned into a deafening roar. The cries of men, the neighing of horses, the clanging of swords against shields, all merged into a single cacophony of death. The dust raised by thousands of hooves blocked out the sun, and the battle continued in eerie twilight, where the enemy could only be distinguished at close range. The Roman legionaries, renowned for their discipline and formation, lost their main advantage. In such close quarters, the formation fell apart, turning into an uncontrollable crowd trying to fight off the enemy, pressing in from all sides. Commanders lost control of their units. Orders were drowned out by the noise or simply did not reach their recipients. The Goths, sensing victory, fought with redoubled fury. From the height of their saddles, the horsemen cut down the Romans from above, piercing their helmets and shields. The Goth infantry, emerging from behind the wagon fort, attacked from the front, giving the Romans no respite. This was the end of organized resistance. The legions, which had terrorized their enemies for centuries, became hunted prey. The gleaming armor and red plumes, symbols of imperial power, were now covered in dust and dirt. The cavalry charge of Aladius and Saphracis is considered one of the most decisive moments in military history. It showed that the era of heavy infantry domination was coming to an end, giving way to an era of heavy cavalry that would reign supreme on the battlefields throughout the Middle Ages. The Roman army was not simply defeated, it was destroyed as a fighting force. Chaos and panic gripped those who remained in the ranks. Hopes of salvation faded with each passing minute. The encirclement tightened. The situation in the center of the Roman formation became critical. Surrounded on all sides, the legionaries found themselves trapped by their own numbers. The crush was so terrible that the soldiers standing in the middle could not even raise their arms to strike or shield themselves. People stood shoulder to shoulder, pressed so tightly together that it was impossible to take a full breath. Those who fell from exhaustion, injury, or heat stroke could no longer get up. They were trampled by their own comrades. It was a terrible death, not from an enemy's blade, but from suffocation and the weight of bodies. Spears broke under the pressure of bodies, shields cracked. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, himself a participant in those events, described it as hell on earth, where the ground was saturated with slippery mud. The inability to fight engendered a feeling of helplessness and doom even in the most experienced veterans. Arrows and javelins fell into this dense mass of people, almost never missing their mark. Every shot found its target, and the Romans had nowhere to hide from this deadly rain. They stood and died, waiting for their turn. Dust clogged their throats and eyes, and thirst drove them mad. Many threw down their weapons simply because they did not have the strength to hold them, or because they understood the futility of resistance. The discipline that had cemented the legions for centuries evaporated under the pressure of animal terror. Roman officers tried to organize some semblance of a defense, gathering small groups of fighters around them. But these pockets of resistance were quickly washed away by waves of Gothic attacks. Communication between units was completely lost. The Imperial Guard and elite units still held out, fighting with the desperation of the doomed. They knew there would be no mercy and tried to sell their lives at the highest price, but their heroism was drowned out by the general chaos and destruction. The sun began to set, but the battle continued unabated. The Goths methodically tightened their ring, destroying the remnants of the Roman army. The battlefield presented a picture of the complete destruction of the greatest military machine of antiquity. The Romans, accustomed to being hunters, became prey on this day. The very tactics of the legion, designed for open space and maneuverability, worked against them in the conditions of encirclement and confinement. It was the moment when the pride of Rome was trampled in the dust of Thrace. The army ceased to exist as a single entity, breaking up into thousands of lonely, frightened individuals. The fate of Emperor Valens in this chaos remains one of the great mysteries of that battle. When the formation finally collapsed, the emperor found himself cut off from his bodyguards and staff, amid the continuous roar of shouts, footsteps, and whistling arrows. The dust was so thick that people could not see more than a few steps ahead. Accounts of his last moments vary, because everyone who survived that day saw only a small fragment of the overall picture, creating an aura of mystery around his death that has not dissipated even after centuries. According to one version, he was wounded by an arrow and tried to hide among the ordinary soldiers, hoping to get lost in the crowd and survive the battle until the Goths retreated. But his wound prevented him from moving quickly. Encased in heavy armor, he fell and rose again, losing strength. In the end, he fell in the general melee, unrecognized by anyone, because in that chaos, no one could distinguish ranks and titles anymore. His body was never found among the thousands of others stripped of their armor and insignia by looters who turned the bodies over in search of valuables. The emperor, who considered himself equal to the gods, disappeared without a trace, like a mere mortal, dissolving into the mass of the fallen. Another, more dramatic version says that Valens' bodyguards carried him to a small fortified estate or hut near the battlefield. There they tried to give him first aid, bandaging his wounds and sheltering him from the shooting Goths. They hoped to wait out the night and leave under cover of darkness while the barbarians were busy looting. The location was not chosen at random. Low walls and small windows gave them a chance to fight back if they were discovered. But the defenders had too little time and strength left. However, a Gothic squad combing the area in search of loot noticed this refuge. They did not know who was inside, but the presence of armed guards aroused their suspicion. When they tried to get closer, the Romans opened fierce fire with crossbows and throwing spears, which made their opponents even more wary. Not knowing who was hiding in the house, but encountering fierce resistance from the guards, the barbarians decided not to storm the fortification, not wanting to lose men. They simply surrounded it with straw and brushwood gathered from the surrounding area and set it on fire, turning the house into a huge torch in the middle of the field. Valens, the ruler of the East, burned alive in a simple peasant hut, abandoned by his army and his luck. There were screams inside, but the flames quickly engulfed the building, and the roof collapsed. Only one of the bodyguards managed to jump out of the window, burned and barely alive, and surrender to captivity so that he could later tell the story to the victors. The Goths were shocked to learn who they had burned, not having paid any attention to it in the heat of battle. They did not expect the emperor to be so close without an army, almost alone, like an ordinary fugitive. The emperor's death was the symbolic end of the disaster. Rome lost not only its army, but also its head of state, the sacred symbol of power. The man whose presence on the battlefield was supposed to inspire the troops. It was a blow to the empire's prestige from which it never fully recovered. Upon hearing of Valens' death, the people realized that power was now in the hands of fate, not of men. Never before since the Battle of Cannae had Rome suffered such a crushing defeat. But then the Republic survived, rose up, and became even stronger, while now the aging empire had received a wound that was incompatible with life. The loss of the army could be compensated for, but the loss of spirit and confidence could not. This catastrophe was a point of no return, after which the process of disintegration became irreversible. The news of Valens' death spread like wildfire, causing shock and awe among all the peoples who had heard of Rome's power. For the barbarians, it was proof that Rome was mortal, that it could be defeated and destroyed. The fear of Rome's name disappeared forever, and this marked the beginning of a new era, where it was no longer the empire that dictated terms, but its neighbors. This realization destroyed the image of invincibility that Rome had built over centuries. The surviving Roman generals fled, abandoning their soldiers and trying to survive at any cost. The system of government collapsed, and everyone saved themselves, unable to restore order. The battlefield turned into a place of chaos, where no one commanded or obeyed anymore. Night fell on the battlefield, hiding the scale of the tragedy, but not diminishing its horror. The Roman Empire awoke the next morning to a completely new and frightening world, where it was no longer the undisputed power, but just one of many powers fighting for survival. The outcome of the Battle of Adrianople was catastrophic. 2/3 of the Roman field army of the East remained on the battlefield. About 20,000 of the best soldiers and officers who were considered the backbone of the imperial defense. These were not recruits, but veterans who had fought in many campaigns. Entire legions, whose history spanned centuries and whose banners were the glory of the empire, were destroyed. 35 senior military tribunes and the emperor himself were killed, which was a blow to the army's command. It was practically impossible to make up for such losses, as the empire had long been experiencing a demographic crisis and could not conscript as many people as before. Years of war, epidemics, and economic decline had made Rome's mobilization reserves too weak. The victory of the Goths opened the way for them to the Balkans. Now they could move freely throughout the empire, plundering and ravaging cities all the way to the walls of Constantinople, which became the last island of safety on the path of the barbarians. Gothic troops burned villages, destroyed crops, and took craftsmen captive, damaging an economy that Rome was already struggling to keep afloat. The Romans had to agree to a humiliating peace, allowing the barbarians to settle on their lands on their own terms, keeping their weapons and leaders, which contradicted all previous principles of Roman diplomacy. For the first time, the empire did not impose its will, but accepted the demands of others. This set a dangerous precedent, a state within a state. The barbarians became not just mercenaries, but a political force dictating their will to the emperors, because any attempt to restrict them could provoke an uprising. They demanded more and more land and privileges, and the rulers, lacking the strength to resist, gave in. The Roman army began to rapidly become barbarized, as there were not enough recruits, and the defense of the borders was entrusted to the same people who had recently attacked them. Commanders were forced to cooperate with tribal chiefs who had their own troops, and this eroded the ancient military system on which the empire was based. Adrianople became a watershed moment in military history. It marked the decline of heavy infantry and the rise of heavy cavalry, which would dominate the battlefields for the next 1,000 years. The Goths showed that a mobile horseman, capable of striking quickly and powerfully, could crush the closed formation of infantry. The image of the invincible legionnaire became a thing of the past, giving way to the image of the knight horseman who would become the symbol of the Middle Ages. Roman tactics, considered exemplary for centuries, proved obsolete in the face of new realities. The myth of Rome's invulnerability was finally shattered. The empire's neighbors saw that the Colossus stood on feet of clay and could be toppled if the right moment was chosen. Soon after Adrianople, other tribes began to test the strength of the Roman defenses, sensing that their fear of Rome was disappearing. This triggered a chain reaction of invasions that 100 years later, in 476, would lead to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Goths had merely opened the door through which the Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, and other peoples would later pass. But the main consequence was psychological. The Romans lost faith in their exceptionalism and in the state's ability to protect them. People who had lived under the empire for centuries felt for the first time that the world, which had seemed stable and eternal, had become fragile and dangerous. The citizens stopped seeing the emperors as defenders and began to perceive them as weak rulers, incapable of stopping the enemy. The sense of security that Rome had prided itself on for centuries crumbled in literally one day. Adrianople showed that even the greatest empires can collapse under the weight of their own mistakes, corruption, and pride. It is a lesson in the importance of negotiation and the danger of underestimating those you consider weaker than yourself. Valens refused to listen to the advice of his generals, acted hastily, and paid for it with his own life and the lives of his entire army. Tactics, arrogance, and political mistakes came together in a chain reaction, leading to a catastrophe that no one could fix. The history of the Goths after the battle is the story of their rise. They became masters of the situation, and their descendants founded kingdoms on the ruins of the empire, creating a new political map of Europe. Their journey from migrants to rulers became a symbol of the changes that shook the ancient world. The echoes of the Battle of Adrianople can be heard through the centuries. They remind us that civilization is a fragile shell that can be easily destroyed by a single misstep, and that no power is eternal if it loses touch with reality. Ultimately, the Battle of Adrianople is not just a story about military tactics, it is a warning across the centuries. We saw how a humanitarian crisis turned into a war because of greed, and how the war was lost because of ambition. Rome fell not because the Goths were stronger, but because Rome itself had rotted from within, ceasing to live up to its own ideals. What parallels do you think can be drawn between the events of 378 and contemporary global crises? Write your thoughts in the comments. It will be a very interesting discussion. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new journeys into the past.